Okay, so I am going to record this session for people who weren't able to attend. And in case you like it and you want to share it with colleagues, we'll make it available probably via YouTube. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Zander Evans. I'm the Executive Director at the Forest Stewards Guild. And today is a session to spend a little time talking about Deadwood and forest management. And I'll get into why we're honing in on this topic and other topics it's linked to in a second. I want to call people's attention to the poll. I think, I'm not sure if I can share it without ending it, but it looks like we've got a good distribution of folks from the Pacific Northwest, Intermountain West, Lake State, Southeast, somebody from the Northeast, and I sit here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we have a good representation of people with different roles, from forester to certification sustainability specialist, somebody who works on wildlife issues and planning issues, and then some other resource specialists out there. So that's great, because I think it takes all of us to get our work done, and it's good to have a diverse representation. So I'll go ahead and jump into the presentation here. And first off, I just wanted to put up the Guild's mission. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Forest Stewards Guild, we're a national nonprofit, and we focus on practicing and promoting ecologically, economically, and socially responsible forestry. And so that's, I probably, if you called into this webinar, it's probably what you practice as well, your sort of focus out in the woods. And this is our 25th anniversary. We've been around for 25 years. We work all across the country. We're a membership organization, so we have professional land stewards, foresters, hydrologists, wildlife professionals, conservationists, etc. A lot of different titles, but all people who focus on stewarding the land in a responsible fashion that balances both the economic needs of a landowner or community and the ecological requirements of the forest. And one of the reasons we do things like this webinar today is that we focus on our members and our members' needs. So we started working on questions of deadwood and biomass harvesting more than a decade ago, because our members came to us and said, hey, we have questions. New markets are opening up. And when we were in school, we didn't necessarily consider a market that would take all this material or this kind of low-grade material. So we want to talk about it. We have some science questions. We have some questions about people who've worked in these sorts of markets before. And so it's really about trying to help land stewards do the best job they can. And we sort of phrase that as putting the forest first. And what does the forest need? Well, recognizing that every landowner has his or her own objectives. And I also, for those of you who don't know me, I did want to put up just briefly, not to toot my own horn, but rather so that everybody feels like what I'm saying actually comes from some knowledge and some study on the topic. Before I was the executive director, I spent a lot of time as research director, and a lot of my work revolved around questions that touch on deadwood, often biomass harvesting or other issues like that. So this isn't super important, but I did want to note that it's not just, I didn't just pick up a pamphlet this morning to talk to you all today. And the Guild has invested a lot of resources over a lot of years trying to meet the needs of our members in specific locations. So we started actually in the Northeast and saying, okay, well, if biomass markets expand, what does that look like? And very quickly we realized, well, deadwood is one of the key elements that might change, and we might have ability to essentially harvest more of the material that would eventually naturally die. And so that could change deadwood. Not that we're going to be, pulling out rotten logs for biomass, but rather that where we have more markets for low-grade material, it provides the opportunity to remove that before it dies. So this is an array of publications that we've done, almost all of which are available on our website. There are a few journal articles that, you know how they are, you have to have special permission. So if there's one, for example, we did one on California, and if you're working, I don't think there's anybody from California, but if that's an area of interest, I can send, oh, we do have a Californian, good. I can send that to you. And I'm gonna share the results here of that poll so everybody can see that we do have a good representation across the country. Okay, so getting back, of course, the Guild is not the only organization thinking about both the changes that might occur given new markets, specifically a biomass market. Plenty of states have their own guidelines, and there's been a lot of talking and thinking about this over the last decade or two. And so we try to draw on this as well. And again, a lot of this, a lot of these guidelines from states touch on issues of dead wood. And so that'll be the link in today. So I think a good place to start as we think about deadwood is why the heck do we even care? Probably this is clear to everybody on this call, but just in case, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, nutrient cycling, carbon storage, water issues around storage and erosion and flow, all are influenced by deadwood. And so I would make the case that, well, these could be considered ecological attributes. Very quickly, we can see the social or economic impact of some of these elements. For example, carbon storage is now a monetizable element of our forests. Similarly, nutrient cycling, if we make our forest stands nutrient poor, then the next rotation might be affected. So there's an economic impact there. So those are some of the benefits. And one of the reasons, because of those benefits, maybe better said, both of the main certifying bodies in the US, SFI and FSC, emphasize deadwood as part of their management standards. They phrase it slightly differently, but they both call out standing dead trees, snags, decaying logs, things like that. So I think many of our folks on the call from forest products companies are certified by both or one of these bodies. And so deadwood is something we have to think about as we're working out in the woods. And specifically, the sort of motivator for getting this information and thinking about it anew was the controlled wood risk assessment from FSC. And so the link is via the emphasis on the risk posed to old growth forests, because one of the key elements of old growth forests is dead wood. And I think we're planning a future webinar specifically on old growth, but in kind of preparing for that, I realized, well, you know, it's actually worth thinking about dead wood as a particular element, in part because it's bigger than just the old growth story. But I think for some of you, this is a link into the controlled wood risk assessment and mitigating that potential risk. So one of the things that we at the Guild have been thinking about is how do we mitigate the risk of controlled wood and share the story of something like old growth with private landowners or procurement foresters or other folks out there to sort of mitigate this risk through education and outreach. And I think one element of that may be talking about deadwood or kind of emphasizing its importance. So my next slide is to remind me to talk about ecological diversity. We have a good representation across the country of folks on this call, and I'm sure depending on where your office is or where you work, you think about deadwood very differently. And whether it's, you know, this is a bottomland hardwood in the Southeast, deadwood is gonna act very differently here than in a fire-driven ecosystem. This is the California Sierras. So the disturbance processes and the quantities, all sorts of elements of deadwood are going to be different. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to move back and forth between some generalizations that we can make about deadwood and some honing in on some specifics. Another way to think about the different regions or diversity across the country, this is some data that was published more than 10 years ago now. Wow, they've got to stay up on this research, but I don't think this has been really improved since 2008. And it's a broad brush looking at where, and in this case, it's honed in on lying deadwood, logs on the ground, essentially. But snags aren't that far off from that. And so it's looking at those quantities in really broad brush, dividing the US up into just a few categories. And it's probably all of us who went through forestry school probably recognize, oh, I understand why it might be the case in those different regions. And we'll talk a little bit more about, why, say, in the Southeast, there's not as much down woody material or large down logs, fire-driven, rapid decomposition, etc. But this is an important aspect to keep in mind as we talk about it. And I also wanted to put a little more than just the picture, put some numbers on it. I thought this might be helpful for our conversation. And I should note that you're welcome to put questions in the chat window. I probably won't deal with them until we get to discussion at the end, but if you want to put them now while you're thinking about it, please do. And they can be questions about a specific slide, like this one on carbon stocks, or more generally. I think I'm hoping for a fairly wide-ranging conversation at the end of the webinar. So I think the take home from this EPA data, again, 10 years old, but I don't think it's really been updated much, is that deadwood actually has a fairly large chunk of the carbon, and carbon is essentially 50% of biomass, so you could probably, these numbers line up almost exactly the same if you were going to look at biomass versus carbon. So deadwood is it's a reasonable chunk of many of these forests, not as big as the live material, but a sizable contribution to our forests, whether we're thinking of biomass or other elements. And in addition to how it changes across the country or in different ecosystems, we need to think about how deadwood changes with stand development. And I'm going to try not to get too deep into stand development. It's one of my favorite topics. But the general curve where we see a lot of deadwood early on at stand initiation and then declining as it is not replaced, but the existing deadwood starts to degrade and decompose as stands reach maturity. There tends to be a minimum of deadwood. And then as stands age, if this is sort of a archetypal undisturbed stand, so as stands age, more trees die over time from a number of processes, and then deadwood starts to accumulate again. And we could look at this a different way with the photos. I took this from a journal article from Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson, although in a sort of inside joke, I used the stand development stages from Oliver and Larson, kind of the two competing paradigms, but I think they actually line up pretty well. And if anyone actually kind of gets that joke, yeah, let me know. It's not very funny. So photo A here with stand initiation, you can actually see in the photo, it looks like maybe a timber harvest. There are saplings, seedlings coming up. There's a bunch of dead material on the ground. And then in the second B, stem exclusion, we see that there's a lot of shade on the understory. Those seedlings, saplings have grown up. There's canopy closure, and there's not much dead material. The material that was there has decomposed, and new material hasn't really been generated. We haven't seen the disturbances come in yet to generate new dead wood. Whoops, let me go back one, sorry. As understory reinitiation starts to occur and we see the canopy open up, some gaps to form, enough so that there's sunlight on the forest floor and new seedlings, shrubs can develop, we're starting to see the decadence, trees die. A lot of the trees, the sort of losers in the battle for light and moisture in stem exclusion, have died as we reach understory reinitiation. And as they die, obviously they add to dead wood. And that just accumulates as we move into this old growth stage. So this is a little preview. When we talk more specifically about old growth, we'll have to get back into stand development again, which, as I mentioned, I like. So the stage that we're at is really important, and it's worth sort of thinking through for the lands that you're involved in management on how this comes into play, because we may, for some landowner objectives, we may spend more time in stem exclusion, and we may have less land area or spend less time in old growth where the dead wood is accumulating. So maybe it's actually worth going back to look at this slide. So if we're worried about the benefits that dead wood provides, if most of our stands are in this sort of middle-aged, mature stage, we may have less dead wood across the landscape than we might otherwise. So obviously disturbances are part of what's driving the availability of dead wood: wind events, breaking off tops or turning over trees, ice storms, insect outbreaks causing dead trees, fire girdling trees, obviously thinning and harvests. Even the most careful operator, with a biomass market isn't going to pull everything out. And so many harvests are going to leave material in the woods. I added drought recently. The last time I gave this presentation, I don't think there were hundreds of millions of dead trees in California due to drought. So it's important to think about that as well. All these factors are going to accumulate over time. And so that's the other part of that stand age curve is even if they're small, if it's a minimal drought, then 1 or 2 trees die, over the couple hundred years that accumulates and adds to the dead wood population. So returning now to the benefits of dead wood, and I'm going to try to wrap up in another 10-15 minutes here and then leave some good time for discussion. But I think this is worth talking a little bit more in detail about. But we do have to acknowledge that dead wood isn't some panacea. We don't want every forest chock-a-block with dead wood. There are issues about harboring insects that then can move to outbreak mode in healthy trees. They're in certain ecosystems, high severity fire. If we're stocking up on dead wood in a fire-driven ecosystem, that can actually be detrimental to some other processes and other attributes we're looking for. So that's this last point, that where we're thinking about dead wood retention, where we're thinking about, hey, it's got a lot of benefits to it, let's keep some of it around, we want to hone that into the ecosystem, specifically where we're managing land. So some generalized statements about wildlife and biodiversity. I actually took this from work we were doing in the Southeast, but it really cuts across regions. And so I just deleted the Southeast and was like, wait a minute, this is still true. So the mammals and birds, reptiles, amphibians, arthropods, gastropods, they may differ in terms of the species that benefits from dead wood from the Southeast to the Pacific Northwest, but you can still link them in, different species, to dead wood. And one point that I often, as someone who focuses on upland forestry, I probably don't emphasize enough, is that our decisions about dead wood in the uplands have specific direct impacts on our hydrology in our streams and water bodies. So I think if there's, I can't remember if we had a hydrologist or water expert on the call, but making sure the right amount of deadwood is in our streams for habitat and protection from predation and that sort of thing. Even aeration of streams is really important. And we're not going to have the deadwood in streams if we don't have it in the uplands. There's a direct connection. So here is very specific guidance from Oregon, looking at the retention of coarse woody material, deadwood on the ground, essentially larger deadwood on the ground, and its relation to small mammals and hence the predators that survive on small mammals. So if we're interested in keeping small mammals or their predators around, here's some guidance in terms of coverage. So not tonnage, but coverage. This slide is a good place to highlight that we can use a lot of different terms: coarse woody material, coarse woody debris, large lying dead wood, all sorts of different phrases for essentially the same element in our forest. And we also can use a lot of different metrics: coverage, sort of surface area of the forest floor, tonnage, number of pieces, all kinds of things. And if you're interested in any of those details, we've got some publications for you. It's a sort of down in the weeds conversation, but can be important. And there's some other tools out there. This is an example of a Forest Service tool that helps managers think about what they're managing for, in this case, more sort of a wildlife perspective, and what that might mean for dead wood. And so I'm not going to get into this tool at all, just to highlight that there are different ways, different pieces of advice out there to try to guide us. And using that tool, I just pulled out this chart, and there are two things I want to highlight in this chart. One is the way they've subdivided Pacific Northwest forests. And so we started with some broad brush looking at, oh, that's where there's a lot of biomass or carbon in dead wood, but there's actually differences between, say, montane mixed conifer and ponderosa pine Doug fir forests, right? I'd actually have to go back and look at how they differentiate those two. But then the other part that's important in this chart, I think, is the horizontal green bars show the difference, the range that was found in natural stands, and then the vertical green or dark line is the average. So it sort of shows you, hey, there's a wide variety, and the average might be a little bit lower than the maximum. And so how you choose to manage, you might say, well, look, I have other objectives than wildlife, and so I need to manage here or there, but I'm going to reference for my forest type, say the average, and sort of shoot for that. And there's a similar set of numbers we can look at for, this is down woody material and percent ground cover. So again, it varies considerably and might give managers some sort of frame of reference, like how much should be out there? Do I just go look at the closest national park and try to use that as a analogy for the stand I'm managing? Well, there's usually, depending on the forest type you're working in, there's usually some guidance to say, well, what is kind of an old growth situation in many cases for dead wood. So changing ecosystems a little bit, down to the bottomland hardwoods again. There's a whole other set of recommendations and a whole other set of questions. One of the issues in bottomlands is where we have flooding, dead wood is going to move around. It's going to float through. You might have worked hard to kind of build up dead wood in a particular stand, and a flood might all take it over to your neighbor. So there's some issues there. But again, there is some science to guide us in terms of wildlife needs and other attributes for Deadwood. And so the Lower Mississippi Joint Venture has come up with this guidance. And the Guild took that as well as some other sources to try to put together some sort of rough guidance for our members and other people who are interested. And one of the things I think I might highlight on this slide is that the bottom line here, Piedmont and Coastal Plain Pinelands, has very minimal sort of Deadwood recommendation based on the science and manager experience. And I think that that's driven by the fire-dominated disturbance regime in that area and high decomposition rates. So it kind of makes sense, but it's nice to have some number to put on it. So if you're trying to, it's hard to achieve goals that we can't measure, and so it's useful to have some numbers. So in general, pulling back to the bigger picture, if I were to summarize it for, a private landowner or a logger or somebody else who may not spend as much time thinking about Deadwood as I do, some basic things. Let's try to retain and recruit snags. They're important to a huge range of wildlife species, and the larger the better. And I say the larger the better because in most of our forested ecosystems, large trees are more rare than they were historically or naturally, and there's some wildlife species who need particularly large cavity trees or snags for elements of their development or reproduction. Similarly, the same is true with large down logs. And so, if we're retaining and recruiting large snags or snags in general, obviously a portion of those becomes large down logs. So there's a link there. But it can be as simple as, and this sort of guidance is in some of the Guild's documents, just asking contractors as they're working in the woods, hey, don't drive over, if there's a nice large log, avoid that as you're driving through. And maybe that's common sense, but I think that it doesn't hurt to get on the same page about some of these things. And then there's a whole other set of conversations where we're thinking less about, say, older stands where we might have some large material, and we're more concerned about soils and nutrients, and that might refocus us on things like tops, branches, and leaves and needles. And one way that I guess it's worth highlighting that all these sorts of guidelines are not static targets. So even those numbers I presented are worth reinvestigating, saying, hey, is there new science out that might help us understand it? And because forest ecology differs so quickly as we move across the landscape from one stand to another based on local conditions, it's important to feel like these are guideposts. They're meant to help managers. They're not supposed to be rigid handcuffs. And I think the creativity of forest stewardship is the most important part. So that's why we sort of frame it in this way. And we developed this graphic to try to keep this in our heads and help explain it. Again, we have some copies of a trifold brochure that was designed to take out into the woods and maybe leave in the truck or the Timco or whatever. And it's really saying Deadwood is important. We want to leave some of it. We want to maintain it out in the woods. And if we're, say, looking at the left axis, if we're on a nutrient poor soil, we might leave a little bit more Deadwood. We might decide, yeah, I could pull that log out for firewood or for some other product, but it's probably actually more worthwhile to leave it in the woods for the wildlife benefit. Similarly, on the top there, we have low intensity harvest to high intensity harvest. If it's we're pulling out more trees essentially, well, that might motivate us to leave more legacies of the previous stand. On the right side there, sites have different amounts of existing downwoody material. And so if you're walking to a site and there's already a bunch of stuff around and a lot of snags, well, you probably don't have to worry about leaving much. And then on the bottom, if we know that we're going to have frequent harvests, if we're going to come back in another 10 years, well, we might leave more because we're capturing, with frequent harvests, we're capturing more of that mortality, the natural mortality. Whereas if we know we're not going to be back for 50 years, well, nature will kill some trees and generate some dead wood. So this isn't, again, it's not meant to be a rigid rule. It's meant to be a guideline that we can kind of keep in our heads and implement as we're marking or setting up sales. So that actually brings me to the end of the Deadwood portion, and I'm really hoping that we can get some conversation, and maybe so we can talk sort of details about Deadwood. And I also wanted to, another aspect of the conversation is to throw out some potential future conversation topics. I'm thinking next month talking about old growth with a Pacific Northwest focus and really honing in on the controlled wood risk mitigation, outreach and education. We've got a draft sort of fact sheet that we're working on that I will share with some partners before that call, and we can kind of delve into that at the, I guess that's end of February, mid-February. So I'm putting that date up for two reasons. One is to see if people are interested in that and get some feedback on if those dates work, if there's some other big meeting I don't know about happening around then. Similarly, we want to talk about Foresters for the Birds. This is a program that Audubon really kind of kicked off and the Guild is helping with in a number of locations. And we want to talk generally about the program, and it's linked into the next bullet, which is conversion from forest to non-forest. We see, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, Foresters for the Birds as a way to engage landowners about their land and basically an encouragement to keep it as forest. And so we'll talk more about it in two different ways in those two webinars. And then the last element, again, related to the controlled wood risk assessment is Klamath-Siskiyou region. And that'll, I don't know, I didn't put a date on this. I'm sort of guessing April just to sort of spread these things out. But if there's a driver that we need to do that sooner, yeah, you should let me know. So I've been talking a lot, and I really want to hear from folks on the phone. Hopefully you can unmute yourself. We have about 35 people on the line, so could get a little noisy if we're all talking, but I think we can, usually people are pretty quiet on these things, so feel free to unmute and join in. Or if you're feeling shy or you think it's more efficient, please feel free to type questions in the group chat window. And those can be questions about basically anything from how the darn webinar is supposed to work on where do I type to when we should have the next webinar. And if no one speaks up, I'm going to start calling out names of folks I know. So speak now before Oh, good. Okay. Good to hear that the webinar timeline works. That's great. And maybe following up on that, Rebecca, I chose noon for Central Timeline, but if other times during the day, early, late, whatever, let me know. So printed materials. So far we don't have, well, let's see. We don't have our fact sheets for the specifically for the controlled wood risk assessment out. They're taking me way longer than I had hoped. So I will be sending those directly to folks who need them. And we do, and if you're looking for other materials like the background guidance, that's on our website. Okay, no voice on the computer, gotcha. So long as you can hear that and type, that's great. Okay, so let's see. We had a question come in that says, where would one turn to find guidelines for specific regions? Further, since many participants are not directly managing, merely advising, what sources exist that are written for the non-professional? Speaking about Deadwood. And that's a great question. I guess I don't want to be too self-serving and point you only to guild resources, but that's what I know about best. So most of our information is written with some basis for professional knowledge, logger, forester, somebody who's working in the woods. And so it's a little, probably for a homeowner or landowner, it might be a little bit tough, but we do have some sort of trifolds, particularly I think for the southeast and for the northeast. And those are, they talk about biomass, but all the sort of retention suggestions are focused on dead wood. So they don't meet your need exactly, related to the question that came in, but hopefully they're a stepping stone. And the old growth for the Pacific Northwest, we're going to do two. There's going to be a fact sheet for kind of Washington, Oregon, probably wet side, and then somewhat similar but slightly honed to the ecology of more fire-driven ecosystems of the interior West and eastern Oregon and Washington. So those will be out soon in May. They're not solely focused on Deadwood, but they will cover, because of the focus on old growth, they'll kind of hit on some of this. Okay, so the Oregon Logging Conference is the 19th through 22nd of, I'm assuming February, is that right, John? Yes, okay. So yeah, we'll have to work around that. And we may try to get, so Kendall Martell works for the Forest Stewards Guild in Oregon, and she may be able to attend that logging conference just to kind of check in and chat with people, and maybe we have some drafts to circulate around there. Yes, and so Jeff Stewart asked, being relatively new to the Forest Stewards Guild, will there be reminders of upcoming webinars? Yeah, so every month in the Across the Landscape, we'll list the webinars, and probably, because this is kind of a somewhat specific subset, if you attended this webinar or even just registered for it, I'll probably email you directly about future webinars, thinking, hey, if you were interested in chatting about dead wood, you're probably going to be interested in old growth and some of these other topics. And obviously you can always choose to delete, but maybe we'll try that direct approach as well, because it can be hard to check the website often enough. Other questions or comments? Yes, so Haley just chimed in with strategies for disseminating this information to suppliers and landowners. Great. Yeah, let's move to that topic. And so, at the risk of reiterating myself, Haley, my basic idea is not to focus on Deadwood specifically in terms of outreach, but to roll that into how we talk about old growth. And our base strategy that I would love feedback, improvements, changes, suggestions for is to build a series of flyers. And I use the term flyer, but essentially I'm talking about two sides of one page to share. They could go out in mailings or other ways. so that's our sort of initial strategy for dissemination. But I would love to hear other additions. I talked briefly with a colleague about short videos. So turning maybe after these webinars, turning a slightly condensed version, trying to hone my talk a little bit down to something that could be a 2-minute YouTube video that someone might be able to share with clients in an email, that give it a little bit of flair, but share it that way. Are there other suggestions or comments or questions around this issue of how we disseminate to suppliers, landowners as part of the risk mitigation work? Okay. I think one of the questions that is in my mind, having done some, kind of outreach to landowners, is it can be really difficult to connect with them, getting a mailing address, or finding out how to talk to them. So one of the things we've been doing in New Mexico on other projects is working through things like tree farms. So I think there's a lot of, one of the reasons we wanted to do these webinars is try to build a little bit more of a community, because I think some of these other partners might be really crucial to getting the word out. And that's actually one of the points of the Foresters for the Birds. I think it's a really engaging way to connect with landowners. And if some of the Foresters for the Birds events are going out and looking at what birds you find in different forests. And if at those events that you engage some landowners in, if you have the brochures about old growth or biodiversity in Klamath Siskiyou, or why conversion is such a threat, that could be a great way to connect with landowners. Okay, so I missed a couple questions here. Mike Ferrucci is emphasizing operational challenges. And I should just acknowledge that one of my first forest operations class was under Mike Ferrucci's tutelage. We won't discuss how long ago that was, because that will give away maybe more than I want to about my age. But yes, so that's a huge issue. Even say leaving snags can be an OSHA violation. There are, in the biomass harvesting guidelines, we try to acknowledge that, but I think most of the best knowledge about that operational element actually resides with professional loggers. And in my experience, often opening up the conversation about what we're trying to do, hey, we want to retain some snags, like you've seen the stand, the harvest layout, how do you think it can be done safely? And with good operators, I think they dive right into that and say, oh yeah, well, I can leave that one over there because it's, I'm not going to drive back over there, or it's out of the way. And that can make a big difference. So I think there is some practical advice, not nearly the kind of research. I don't think there's a lot of forest operations research happening out there, and particularly on this issue. So a lot of that has to be professional experience and peer-to-peer learning. So that might be we're planning some on-the-ground learning exchanges, and I think that's the kind of thing that's great to discuss out in the woods, because if you can get a mix of foresters, land stewards, contractors, loggers, you can really get down to the nuts and bolts of that. And it differs depending on the ecosystem. So not a great answer, Mike, but hopefully at least acknowledging the importance of that operational challenge. And Jared asked about continuing education credits. Yes, I just this morning got the alert from Society of American Foresters that we're accepted for continuing education credits. So email me, Zander, I guess it's up on the screen, zander@forestguild.org. If you want continuing ed credits, let me know, and I'll sort of verify based on the webinar attendance that you were on the webinar. I'll send that into SAF, and it should show up in your CFE credits. Okay, other questions. So Mark Vandermeer, oh, some info, good. So Mark, just to read this out in case other people aren't looking at it, Mark is emphasizing another reason to retain larger diameter coarse woody debris. The ratio of heartwood to sapwood is much greater on a large log. And since the heartwood decomposes much differently than the sapwood, usually involving brown rot, where it's removing the cellulose, leaving the lignin, it's a different environment. And then the lignin is much more difficult to decompose. So the end product of the brown cubical rot in the heartwood is a residence time, and I'm guessing he's referencing Montana where he works, several hundred years, and even can be located below ground. So it's water holding and presumably some unique habitat maybe for insects. So I think that's a great example where the kind of material we're leaving, dead log is not the same as a dead twig, or it makes a difference what's out there. And then Chris Longmore chimes in about more on the outreach side, the late spring, the contractors meeting as a means of updating and educating contractors on the state of the forest and how to adapt to operating changes. And this is a great opportunity to outreach and connect and educate all the shareholders. So I think I'm hoping to work with Chris in the meetings he's going to attend and provide him with the materials. That was where this idea of maybe a short video came up, taking something a little sped up, a little honed in version of this webinar and sharing it as a way to start the conversation. And then having the handouts as a way to give somebody something to take home and stick in the truck, or just remember, oh yeah, Deadwood's important, or yeah, maybe I shouldn't drive over that log. Okay, so foresters, loggers, landowners do work in the place where printed materials get lost. Yes, damaged, wet. Field-oriented handouts that are short, large printed, bulleted, bright colors, and rugged material will last longer. Yes, so we have trifolds printed on, it's kind of a Tyvek paper. And I'm sure we can always improve our layouts, make them sort of pop more, but we have tried, and I think that that's continuing effort. It's also more difficult to just ignore them. Yes, so the more engaging they are, the more likely we are to see them put in use. And then Mike also points out that BMP manuals in many places are being published in smaller formats, so they fit in a pocket for a cruising vest or in a machine. And I think one of the sort of long-term goals, at least from a guild perspective, but probably shared with folks on this call, is continuing to have these conversations and getting some of these ideas and guidance and science-based recommendations into BMPs. Obviously, state BMPs are going to have a much wider reach than things that I do. And so, but at the same time, we've had good success in connecting directly with state forestry agencies and others who are thinking about BMPs. And so maybe making adjustments or additions to BMPs can be a way to get this message to a broader audience. Another suggestion is an app. With a Forest Stewards Guild app with different biodiversity conservation BMP bullets. Yeah, that's a good idea. Now, we have tried the app before, but I think, yeah, I'm not sure, it's a little early for us in terms of getting into the digital, and I'm not sure we did as well as we could have. But I think that that's right, that even though many of us are out in the woods to avoid things like telephones, I would bet that almost every land steward out there, logger, has a digital device with them even if it's not connected to the internet. If you had an app that had the static information, it could be very valuable. So I think that's a good point. And I think my instinct is that that's a later effort. Once it's a little bit easier to hone, at least for me, in a presentation mode or in a written mode, and then maybe we can boil that down in the same way that Mike is talking about, big bullets, main points, and then that would be the kind of information that might serve well in an app. And we do have, one of the things that we always try to do at the Guild is connect back to the science. So it's really important to be able to say, well, gee, you said that, I don't know, Deadwood has a water holding capacity or something. What's the science that supports that? And being able to point back to that. And so that's another way an app could be useful, because it can include all those links. Okay, let's see. Other questions or comments? I like this conversation, and I think I will save this chat window, because I think there are probably nuances that I'm glossing over here as I talk, but I think there's a lot of good points in here. I guess maybe the last question that I'll ask people is, did you find this basic format useful of, a brief presentation on the front end, some conversation? Is this, having been through this Deadwood discussion, are you likely to attend the old growth or Foresters for the Birds or conversion or Klamath Siskiyou webinars, discussions? So you could just, if you have time to just pop in a sort of quick, thumbs up, thumbs down kind of thing, that'll help guide me a little bit. Okay, good. Maybe I just wanted a little confirmation that this went okay. Okay. It is, it's a little strange, because with a normal, human audience, you can gauge from how much people are looking at their phones while you're talking. But with the digital, you're never sure. So good. Okay. That's great. And definitely feel free to reach out to me directly after the webinar if you want to follow up on an idea, or part of this conversation, or you see a good avenue for a whole other topic that I haven't even brought up yet, or some other nuance there. Well, I think not to keep people on longer than they need to be, maybe this is a good time to wrap up. And I know someone just texted in that they had another call to jump to, so hopefully I left you a little time to grab a coffee or something before your next meeting. Thank you so much to everybody for joining on and contributing with questions and comments, and look forward to future conversations. And with that, I will close off this webinar, if I can remember how to do it.